Right. How Steve Jobs destroyed female enrollment of computer science. The first computer programmer was Ada Lovelace. She was born in 1815, and something to note is that computers did not exist yet. As you can see, the mention of the first modern computer, 1936. So how was she the first computer programmer? Well, when she was growing up, one, she had a really interesting, like, parents. Her mom married, this was like, I believe this was in back in the times where like women were just grown up to be wives to husbands. But her mom had this interesting upbringing where like her parents actually got her education, and so she but she ended up marrying this guy who was really famous locally, and like he was like he was like really well known. He was an artist and a creative type, but he had a ton of debt because he was like super popular. He just kept spending any money that came his way. And so by the time he met like Ada's mom, they never even gave them the dowry because he was so much in debt. And they ended up separating after having a couple children. And so Ada lived with her mom, and one of the weird side effects of that is that Ada's mom got her like all the best tutors, but she went through all these things where anytime any tutor would get too close to her or did too well, they would fire them and hire a new one because his dad or her dad had an affair with one of like her tutors. And then it also cut out any sort of the arts, any sort of creative activity because she was afraid that was the reason for her dad's like poor finances and everything. So she kept showing all this creative drive. She had this idea that she wanted to fly, and she wanted like a book of studied on birds where like she could look into it, and she had this idea of like a horse body with wings and you could like fly. And so she had all these creative ideas, and like her mom was constantly just like, no, you're like, well, we're giving you this great education, which was pretty unique at the time. But like she would completely shut down any of these thoughts. Eventually, of course, she was like slated to marry, da da da. But there was this guy, Charles Babbage, who was extremely, extremely wealthy and known in like the science community. And he had this thing called the difference engine, which was basically a steampunk calculator. And it was just a bunch of gears and shit that you would crank a thing and it would do computation. And so like he was paid like what was the equivalent of millions of dollars to build this from the government because they were like, hey, this would be very useful for like navigation and shit. Because right now we literally just have people in rooms doing the calculations, and we'll pay to build this difference engine. And so he had like 1/7 of it built, I think is what they said. And it's like he would show it off to people as a thing of what he has built, but like he never finished it. And they still never finished it until people like recreated it years later as kind of like an homage because of course we're talking about them now, so they're famous. So people eventually built it, but he never built it. But when he was showing like this initial draft of it to people, Ada Lovelace was one of the people who saw it. And she was like instantly enthralled, and she learned all about it. And then at a certain point, Charles Babbage had this idea before he ever finished a difference engine for the analytical engine, which improved like two major drawbacks and was theoretically better in all this way. He like completely shifted gears and like never finished the thing that he was contracted to do, and was building this new machine in his head that could handle like rounding numbers, which was a big deal because a third is three repeating. Is like, oh, you need to round that at some point, and so like it could handle that. And then it also used punch cards, which if you've ever heard people talk before, punch cards were used for computer programming up until like the previous last generation, where if you talk to anyone who was a programmer back in like the 50s, they used punch cards. eventually punch cards were actually taken from this guy who used it in a loom, where they had these big, basically organ keys to figure out which filaments went where, so you could put in intricate designs. And they just figured out a mechanical system where you could punch the design in a card in like a 2D space, and the loom could automatically read it and do it, and you wouldn't have to have a person
Was that
push it
Babbage's
in.
idea?
No, so Babbage stole the punch card idea from the loom maker, and he used it uh, for his analytical engine design. So this calculator was going to use punch cards based on what the loom person did.
So this was all like, if this was all like, this seems like arbitrary computation before the modern computer. So like, what was this? Was this just solving like was this like how they did physics, or how they did like other just like mathematical equations, or like what was this? What did this do?
So obviously, mathematics has been a study since the ancient times, but well, because we all know of Aristotle, like people were thinking about mathematics long before, like basically since the invention of numbers and and stuff. People were like thinking about mathematics, even though it didn't really have a useful thing for many years. Which, I mean, obviously it's did very quickly with architecture and stuff. But this was specifically like when you were navigating on the seas, you would have to do a ton of calculations, and so it was good for the Navy. And the government, there's a lot of uses. That's the only one I can remember. But like, there's obviously a lot of value to it because they were already doing the computations by hand for all these different things. It was a lot of like sciencey type of stuff, but it was like, oh, this is actually valuable as stuff that we are already doing by hand. Why don't we do it with a computer that doesn't make mistakes? And most importantly is you kept have to recalculating the same thing over and over again, and it just wasn't a fun job, basically.
Is this in England?
I do not remember. I believe so.
Okay.
What happened is Charles Babbage wrote a paper on the analytical. Well, actually, what happened is a French guy saw the analytical engine, wrote a paper on it, and published it. And he, like, Charles really appreciated that. Babbage liked it. And then Ada Lovelace was already in communications with him through the mail. And she was like, hey, I will write a translation into English for this paper, because she was trying, basically Babbage kept trying to get more money to build the analytical machine, because, you know, all his money was from grants from the government to build the difference engine, which he still hadn't finished. But he was trying to get money for this analytical engine, and so he was trying to get more, like, basically PR for this thing. And so he was like, oh yeah. And then that's when Ada first worked with Babbage, and she wrote it. But something he said was like, oh, why don't you add your own notes to the paper? Like, why don't you write your own paper, basically? You seem to know a lot about it. Like, you seem pretty smart. And then so what she ended up doing was she translated it, and then she added her like editor notes. But her editor notes were 3 times the length of the original paper that she translated. And it had all this stuff. But one of the things in those notes, note G, she wrote an algorithm of, like, she was thinking, oh yeah, if you were to do this one thing, she wrote an algorithm to process a certain number set, a number sequence, which obviously doesn't matter, but basically that note is regarded as the first computer program, where she was forward thinking enough to be like, at some point, we can develop a machine to do this algorithm for us using these sets of instructions. And that's kind of what an algorithm is, but she was the first one to kind of abstract it, where the actual operations are separate from the numbers, and like you can define them in order to a sequence of events, which is how we define a program. And so some of the other ideas she had in that paper was also interesting, where like you could, you know, if you took the operations away from the numbers could be colors or notes, and the computation could create music or art. And it's like, that's actually pretty revolutionary thinking, because, you know, nowadays we have a computer screen that is displaying a picture that is actually numbers that have been translated into art. And it's like, so she was actually kind of like a forethinker on this type of idea, which is why this is now considered the first computer program. And then they ended up working some more, and at a certain point, she had a interesting life from there on. But at a certain point, she like offered to do PR to try to get this thing built, and there was a bunch of politics going on, and like he just kind of refused, and we're still not sure why. There's some books about it, and like that was the last like they conversed. But to this day, she is considered the first programmer, and Alan Turing, who is also one of, he is gay. He's also considered like one of the founders of computer science. Almost all of his work like references Ada's initial thoughts and writings, and like he'll constantly refer back to her initial work. And so Alan Turing, you know, has his ideas about like the Turing machine, and like he argued certain things where the Turing test is this test where it is a machine capable to be indiscernible from a human. And like Ada argued that that could never happen, and he argued it could, and then he developed the test to figure out like, I think it could at someday, obviously not yet, and we're still not there to that point.
He said he committed suicide.
I think so.
I don't know.
Or maybe he just died from
the chemical castration.
Yeah.
I don't know. In fact, Ada Lovelace actually, her doctor, she died extremely painfully. This was one of the things I read, where her doctors prescribed her opioids because that was supposed to help, and then it was making her feel really drowsy. And at the time, brandy was considered a stimulant. But they also prescribed her copious brandy and opioids.
Oh, good.
So she was drinking and doing opioids.
So she basically just died like
until like her liver failed and like was in extreme.
She basically just died like Jimi Hendrix died.
Yeah, but a lot more painfully and slower, because it wasn't. She wasn't getting a high. She was just doing things that was killing her. Turing also has this thing called the Turing machine, and that was my initial idea for a PowerPoint, because someone proved he has this thing called a Turing machine, which is the theoretical computer program that can run any computation. And to this day, any computation that can be run by a computer can be run on a Turing machine. Turing machine is theoretical because it has infinite tape, is what they call it. And so my initial idea for this is someone proved that Microsoft PowerPoint is a Turing machine. It is only limited by the actual computer's memory of like, obviously it's not infinite, but it can do the same computations that that basic machine can do, where you can move to the next slide, and depending on the certain animation you give it, it can either like read or write a different number or operation, and you can hyperlink it to a different slide. And it turned it into a literal programming language.
The limits of human engineering cannot keep up with just the raw power of Microsoft PowerPoint.
Exactly.
Microsoft PowerPoint has killed God.
This is not a joke. When I was in the 2nd grade, I got a certificate that said that I was the princess of PowerPoint.
But yes, so Microsoft PowerPoint. There's also a thing where like you said you have infinite knowledge, but he also proved that a computer, no matter how powerful, cannot compute every possible problem. And it's called the halting problem.
Can't. Yeah.
Anyway, I put the invention of the first modern computer in there just to show like Alan Turing was there when they actually had what a computer was.
What was a computer at that time?
So before the modern computer of how we understand it, which was 1936,
Sure.
a computer was literally a person, usually a woman, sitting at a desk with a literal spreadsheet, which was just rows and columns on a paper and doing calculations. They were literally computing whatever business need needed to be computed, which is they literally had spreadsheets, literal pieces of paper, and it was a person, and their job title was computer.
So the first computers were women.
Yes.
And the problem with these women was that they had a finite amount of tape.
And then the last thing for this slide is like Ada Lovelace is still kind of regarded currently. There's a programming language that was commissioned by the Department of Defense called Ada, and it's used in like flight traffic control and banks and stuff. It's kind of an older language now, but it's robust. And there's also Ada Lovelace Day, which celebrates women in STEM, and that's the second Tuesday in October.
Nice.
All right, now on to the spicy stuff.
Mm.
So women in all degrees were slowly growing, including computer science, just in general, as women became
Autonomous.
yeah, basically. Like, and then all of a sudden there's a turn and the number of women in computer science starts to plummet, even when it kept growing in all the other majors. And only within the last 4 years have we seen any sort of upward trend. But
so women were going up in like biology and chemistry, but not computer science?
yeah, look at this.
Okay.
Literally all majors, including the other STEM majors, so it's not like a STEM in general, were going up. And out of nowhere, 1984, there's just a giant drop, and it's now down to 20%. And it's just recently in the past 4 years, it's gone up to like 22%.
Man.
But like it was growing with all the others, and now they're all reaching like pretty close to 50%. And computer science just kind of dropped out of nowhere. And what happened? 1984. What the hell happened? In 1984, Apple released the Macintosh, and they ran a $1.5 million Super Bowl ad to market it to the public. A lot of people attribute this drop to the fact that personal computers were starting to arrive in people's homes, and they're marketed towards boys as like toys and to play video games. And you know, you could program on them, but since those home computers were marketed towards boys and males, people think that's one of the reasons for it. Yes. And so we have these Apple ads. A wise man owns an apple. And then I have this article that's completely unrelated, but it looked like a good headline for my point. And then in conclusion, it's satirical. There's really no correlation that can be drawn with Steve Jobs ruining everything. So I was looking at it because it was like, okay, there was actually this giant drop in women in CS. And then I looked up, it's like literally the same year the Macintosh was released. And then it's like, okay, I cherry picked all these sources to prove my point. Yeah, so IBM was way bigger computer company for a long time. Macintosh still had another couple years. I still blame Steve Jobs.